Today we're going to set up the GE MDS orbit radios. Here I have 3 LN200 licensed radios currently operational. We're going to review the setup, the different functions between legacy and standard operation, and we're going to get into how to configure and what's important when configuring a licensed 200 orbit telemetry system. Thanks for watching. Okay, we're looking at the GE MDS Orbit Device Manager, currently focused on the device overview page. And again, this is a tutorial on setting up the licensed 200 platform using either FSK or QAM modulation schemes, also known as legacy or standard operations. Just a few things I want to point out. The top left corner, we have our GE meatball and icons. These are going to give you different things like your quick kind of indications as to your signals, your statuses, alarms. We also have advanced and basic, which are navigational modes, which are going to change the overall interface from this more advanced interface, which gives you access to your layer 2, layer 3 functionality, and pretty much the complete subset of function within the orbit device. The basic's going to be ideal for someone who's used to the iNet products, layer 2 bridging sort of operation, real simple to interface, and more specific and targeted configurations. I recommend this for anyone starting off, especially if you're having issues with a gateway. Here it makes it really simple to configure a static route, which in the orbit is necessary for a gateway configuration. That being said, you've got your GE product in the top right corner here. Underneath of that we have our firmware version and our interface description. We can easily click on the firmware version to go to the firmware page and sort of see what the device is running and what it is also inactively available to us. And that's kind of the basic overview to the device manager. With that being said, now we're going to sort of dive into the LN2 configurations. So if you've ever used an orbit radio, you've seen this warning many times. It can be kind of annoying and frustrating, but the reality here is you're using the default admin password and the orbit's warning you about that. The orbit meets really secure requirements, and because of that, GE is not able to help you if you lock yourself out of an orbit platform radio. What does that mean? That means that you need to really take into consideration things like the one-time recovery passwords, which I'm not going to cover in this video, and knowing that at any time someone could quote-unquote brick your product and you would have to return it to GE. They give you a discounted cost for only resetting the password, but nonetheless at cost. So I highly recommend that you set a password or ignore this message and sort of just get used to it. Okay, so now we're just going to go through the LEDs and then we can pretty much get started on the configuration. The LEDs are critical to troubleshooting in the field and can provide a lot of useful information. They do change as far as patterns depending on the operation. So if you're using FSK or legacy operation versus standard or QAM operation, then these patterns are going to change. Okay, I know you really want to get into setting these up, but there's just a lot of things that you have to take into account when migrating or looking into a radio system, specifically just the minimum requirements of operation of that system, and really just before you can start blame the radios for the problems, right? So these are the basic requirements that GE has sort of listed for proper operation, and that is adequate and stable primary power, secure connections, antenna, data, and power, a clear transmissions path between associated units, an efficient, properly installed antenna system, proper configuration of unit settings, correct interface between the unit and other equipment. So, what does that mean to me? For power, you really need a good power supply. You need to make sure that you're looking at the power settings and what they require for operation of the RF output, right? Wi-Fi added is important if you're talking about total available power. Secure connections, refraction, water, damaged cables, broken elements on the antenna. Like, these are important. Clear transmission path is important. If someone's built a building in between your last propagation study, you may be sort of chasing your tail, right? Properly installed antennas, are they aligned? Have they shifted? Have they moved? Are they just no good? That's all important as well, and should always be considered when taking somewhat large assumptions on these systems. Proper configuration of units is critical. I can't stress this enough. You don't even have to really do a lot, but you should take everything to an account and just really think ahead, if at all possible, when setting up these Ethernet radio systems. Gateways, networking, and routing is new to a lot of people, and how to connect that and how to sort of interface those networks is critical. I just recommend learning about gateways and static routes and subnetting as best as possible, but mostly just stick to basic mode on the device operation, and you should be okay with gateways and things like that. Okay, last on the LEDs, just pay attention to the NIC slots and where your interface is located to know which LED to pay attention to when troubleshooting. If it's red, it's not associated to an access point, or the access point does not have any remotes associated to it. If it's green, it's linked with an access point, or the access point has at least one remote linked to it. Okay, so let's see how our radios are set up. So again, we have 2 remotes and 1 access point. I'm currently on the access point, and right now I'm looking at the LN radio's status or statistics, right? So this is just, again, in basic operation. I'm going to go ahead and just simplify this a little more in this video. And by clicking on radio, we see our statistics, and we can come down to last RX packet and connected remotes and endpoints and get a visual of what this radio network looks like from the access points standpoint. So here it's showing us our last RSSI of -87, an EVM of 2, which would suggest that we have some errors, and last modulation use was QAM 64, which in this bench test, all the radios are fixed configured for QAM 64. You can see the rate, and this is the symbol conversion rate, giving us an estimated 57 kilobits a second. We can see one associated remote, which by kind of widening the gap between the radios on my bench, I sort of adjusted some of the RSSI, hopefully. And GE recommends setting the LN radio to refresh every 3 seconds if doing any sort of alignment on the radios, so antennas, if you want a true accurate sort of representation of your signal. 128 minus 128 RSSI, just representing that we're not communicating any traffic. We can see again my 1.3 remote is associated, but I'm still not seeing my 1.2. Okay, so I've reboot my second remote, and I'm sort of just sitting, letting the page refresh. Okay, so my remote's come up after a reboot, and I can see here that I've got some EVM. Again, we'll get into that a little later, but that's just suggesting I've got some errors in the data transmission, and my RSSI is higher. I'm been kind of struggling with this remote for a while, so the issue right now, honestly, is my bench design, and I think I've got a little interference happening. Okay, so the two first things we should go through are the radio mode and device mode. So this is really critical, and is something that should be taken into account when looking into legacy to LN systems and the migration thereof. A lot of the mode and device operations are going to come down to what sort of system you're using in or connecting to, if you're doing standard or legacy operation. So we can see here in radio mode, this is where our modulation is really going to come into play. Standard and store and forward are using LN modulations, which is QAM, QPSK, 16 QAM, 64 QAM, and adaptive or automatic. Now these are native LN operations and would only be used in a new LN system, and are not backwards compatible to the SDs or the X710s. If we needed to connect to one of those networks, we would need to select either transparent serial or packet with MAC, and that's going to sort of give us our 3 FSK, 7 SFK options, frequency shift keying. This is a different type of modulation, and this is the reason why the LN is not compatible with the legacy networks. If you're doing a migration, this is concern is getting these 3 FSK systems onto QAM, and it's something that will sort of take some in-place upgrades as well as hardware upgrades with the orbit. In this scenario, we're using standard because we're running a LN interface, and this unit is currently configured as a device mode of the access point. We can see here we have remote and store and forward node as an option. Store and forward is only usable if the radio mode is in LN store and forward mode. Itself is saying that the radio will be sort of switching back and forth from a remote to an access point, and it will be forwarding those packets on when in that access point operation. So in this scenario, we're running the access point, so we've got that set up. We're using the default network name, which GE has already given us. By default, data compression is enabled, header compression is enabled, power. This unit supports up to 10 watts. Now that is not a constant 10 watts, but in bursts. We have our frequencies, which I've got a simplex pair added now. Do not use these. I take no risks. You really need to make sure you have the correct equipment to not be interfering with licensed systems in your area. Your channels, channel size, this is important. This is going to be defined by your license type and split. And this is also going to help with your speed. So the better your license, the more throughput. In our scenario, we're just using the default, which is 12.5 kilohertz, 9.6 KSPS symbols, I think, per second or something like Something to note here is this is kilohertz, and if we look at our frequencies, they're showing us in megahertz. So make sure you understand that there is some conversion that has to take place. If you have a 12.5 kilohertz gap, that it translates to a 0.0125 megahertz difference, right? And I am not an RF engineer. I'm as confused as you are on this sometimes, right? Modulation, this is where we can set the different speeds, QPSK, quadruple, and then we have QAM 16, QAM 64. I'll show you, we'll talk a little bit more about, constellations and just sort of the difference in how the signal is sent on these links and why it operates so much differently, and why EVM and the signals really are important on the LN system, so much less than on the legacy. Automatic is referencing adaptive modulation. This basically allows the radio to decide, based on its signals, which modulation scheme to use. QPSK, QAM 16, QAM 64, and this is represented in a picture. I'm gonna hopefully show up in the corner somewhere, referencing the seasons and the weather, and how the radios can sort of adjust given that environmental impact and issues as well. FEC, this is going to help with forward error correction. By default, it's disabled, and it basically controls errors and weak signals. So if you have really bad sites, this is great for helping give them a small but sometimes needed dBm boost. Security, by default, is not enabled. This is your encryption, encryption types, and encryption, method, whether 128 or 256. And so this is your basic setup. So, we have two other remotes configured. In those scenarios, they are using standard radio mode. They are set up as a remote. Their power is seemingly the same. Their frequencies are all the same because we're doing a simplex operation, so one at a time. Their channels are all the same. This is a really easy one to sort of get you tied up. If your channels do not match, the remote will not connect. Their modulations are fixed to QAM 64. GE recommends doing this in bench testing, but by default, adaptive modulation is enabled, and I do recommend it. It's really sort of impressive, actually, how well it works. And those are your basic, requirements to setting up the GE MDS orbit. So now that I've showed you what it really takes to set up an LN radio, I want to also show you some of the advanced functions of the access point. And we're also going to actually look at one of the remotes currently on the network. So we're going to connect to this remote over the air, which can be something that's not necessarily possible for your network depending on your overall throughput and speed. But the MDS orbit does give us a proxy server functionality through web management, which gives us a stripped down version of the interface on the remote, and it does that through the AP. So I just click on our RF interface icon. It's going to take us to the LN radio status. We're going to scroll down to our connected remotes, and I'm going to go ahead and select 1.3 since it's been giving me the least problems today. So right away, if we look at our URL, we can see where we're connected to the AP using port 320. This is our web proxy to our remote. And if we go ahead and sign in, keep in mind this is a 56K network, so we are practically using dial-up speeds. Now, using the web management interface, we are dealing with a proxy, so just be aware of what you're doing when you're doing it, because it's not going to give you all the information that you would see if you were directly connected to that remote. And in some instances, it will reference the access point when you're really configuring the remote. So, it's really easy to kind of get turned around, and I just really recommend that if you're not certain of something, closing it out, trying it again. So on this remote, we're going to just go ahead and click on our RF icon. That's going to take us to our LN status page eventually. And here we can see that our interface is up. We can go to LN radio. We can see that our remote, current device remote, is complete. It's associated. We can see, our firmwares, our success, our errors, retries, the remote's current RSSI. Now this would be the RSSI coming from the access point. It's running QAM64 modulation. It's got a 0 EVM, which means there's no errors in its signal. And our last packet was received around -69, QAM64, and it's got a rate of about 57.6 kilobits per second. So this is, great, and this remote's working really well here. We can go to configuration and just take a glance at its configurations. So again, we're running standard native LN operation. This is a device mode of a remote. We're using the default network name, default header, and data compression. We've got our power turned down. We've got our matching frequencies, matching channel. We've got a fixed QAM64 modulation, and security and FEC are both disabled. And we've cookie cuttered this setup into our second remote. So we've gone through the setup of the access point, the remote. We've kind of gone through how to visualize a network from the access point, how to see those connected remotes, how the web management and the sort of built-in proxy to connecting to those remotes using their GUI, graphical user interface. And some of the other things we just want to kind of touch on are the signals, RSSI versus EVM, explain a little bit about the difference and how it really is impacted by the modulation type being used, legacy or standard. Cover some of the advanced settings, things like ARP cache, thresholds, and data retries. Starting from here, these are some of the extras and the I guess you could say the tweaks that you would want to look into after getting these systems online. And data retries is a really important one. A lot of SCADA systems will have data retries built in. So you may not want any retries, or you may want to take this down from the default 7 to something more reasonable like 3, maybe even just 1. Packet TTL, if you have a lot of latency and delay in your network, you may need to increase this. You may want to decrease this. Endpoint age timeouts, allow retransmits, ARP cache, thresholds, fairness for QoS, discovery for QoS, and alarm thresholds and counts. So these are all triggers for your alarms and your thresholds when it comes to adaptive modulation, and sort of defining what the rule is when it comes to using these modulations and speeds. So in this case, by default, GE is saying when the RSSI is -85 or greater, we're gonna use QAM16. When it's -70 or greater, we're going to use QAM64. So, you may need to tweak these if it's kind of flipping and flopping a lot. Maybe it's on the edge of one or the other. ARP cache is great if you're dealing with a lot of layer 2 communications. Allen Bradley are known to do a lot of this, where they're constantly sort of ARPing beneath each other, to each other. What this does is it allows the GE radio to receive and acknowledge those ARP requests without transmitting them over the air. It will allow some to go through, but ultimately it will do the responding and minimize that over-the-air traffic from the ARP request. Allow retransmit is going to allow remote-to-remote traffic when the AP is communicating between them. So, if you want to go from or send data from one access point or remote to another, this would allow it. So that covers the advanced configurations. If we kind of get into some of the others, we want to talk about signals and EVM. So if we go back to status, we can kind of scroll down to our connected remotes, and we'll start here. So, we can sort of see where our two remotes are sort of set up. Now we're running 1.2 as QAM64 minus 86, but if we notice, our threshold was actually minus 85, right? So, we're actually running it. We should be running that on QAM16, but we're running it on QAM64, and that's probably why I'm having so many issues with it. Is it's just not really able to keep up, and we can see that it does have some EVM errors as well. So, what does all this mean? When dealing with these systems, it's crucial that you know what your current signals are to the network, and understand that this is going to impact the speed and the reliability of that system. With the LN product, given the overhead for Ethernet communications, the current recommended total amount of remotes per access point is around 40 units. After about 40 remotes, the system is just unable to sort of keep up with the addressing and the overhead. GE is working on a high capacity master product that would allow for greater numbers that you would see in the older legacy systems. Right now, if you're working on a migration and you're coming off of a X710 system going to a LN system, what you want to keep in mind is you really need to upgrade the operation within your legacy operation before really even considering going to LN. So that really means that you need to try and get off of X710 mode onto packet with Mac operation, which is going to be the baseline for an LN supported system. And there's some things to be aware of. B code versus A code and analog versus digital. The Orbit is only compatible with A code systems, digital systems, and non-continuous keyed systems. So this maybe will be covered in another video, but for now, just be aware of this. Talk to GE if you have any questions before really planning these migration paths. So if you're having trouble following along, please forgive me. There's a lot of information to cover, a lot of thought to really think through on these systems, and I'm sort of just kind of touching on some of the critical components and functions that you should be aware of and how they're sort of tied together. So, what I've done at this point is I've gone ahead and manually configured my two remotes on QAM16 to help improve their signals. Remote 2 has been giving me issues today, and it's been kind of hard connecting to it while it was in QAM64. So I went ahead and put it to 16, which has significantly increased its RSSI. If you recall, it was really hitting high 85s earlier. So just changing its QAM has significantly improved its signal quality, and it's even removed all the errors. So this is another win for adaptive modulation, and the idea that when set on these remotes, it really gives you the most out of your radio without having to fix in a speed, run slow all the time. So in this scenario, now that remote should be accessible where it really wasn't in the past. So now I can definitely jump on this. It's working a lot better. So looks can be deceiving. I'm trying to connect into .2 again. It's been troubled all day. Come back over here and look at this. My signal's now minus 91. So that's not even really QAM. That's like QPSK. So, I still feel like I'm having a interference problem. Either too much power, not enough power, and changing the QAMs are going to affect that as well. So, I could spend a little bit of time on this trying to tweak it to figure out the best threshold, the best distance. And these are just concerns and things that you need to be aware of when doing your testing in-house or in the field. If your remotes are 2 inches apart like mine are, you need to have dummy loads, you need to have attenuators. When they're in the field, that may not be a problem. But your signals are critical to these systems and critical to your performance in operation. Too close is as bad as too far.